Hey crew, before we get started today, I just wanted to remind you that we have a Discord channel at Just Enough Trope on Discord. If you want to join us, you can follow the link in our show notes to join conversations about all your favorite pop culture topics. Star Trek, obviously, right up there, first of all, and also sci-fi, fantasy, TV shows, movies, comic books, video games, all those things that your parents said that you were too good for. They were wrong! You're not too good for them. In a good way. Join us on Discord and discuss all of your favorite nerdy topics. We'll be waiting for you. I'd also like to point you to our Patreon at patreon.com/EISTpod. If you want to support the show, if you like what you hear, we would appreciate it. For just a small contribution per month, you can gain access to even more content from enterprising individuals. More information available at patreon.com/EISTpod. My guest on the show today is sci-fi and fantasy author Catherynne Valente. I was so glad to get a chance to talk with her about Star Trek, also the intersection between sci-fi and fantasy that happens in Star Trek, and many, many, many other aspects of Trek, which you'll hear on the episode. Please check out the links that we have in the show notes to her work, to her Patreon as well. Follow her on social media. We'll be back next week for a special spooky Halloween Star Trek presentation. So join us then. Along those lines, I'd like to point you to our sister show, Backtracking, on this same network, where we're talking about the Salem Witch Trials, the film about the Salem Witch Trials, based on a play about the Salem Witch Trials called The Crucible, and the intersection of the Salem Witch Trials with the Star Trek universe in the Star Trek animated series episode, The Magics of Megas 2. If you ever wanted to see Kirk and Spock summon the devil at a slumber party, you win the fanfic challenge, but also you're in luck because that's exactly what happens in the Magics of Megas 2. So check that out. That's at Backtracking on Twitter, at BACKTREKKING. That's it. Hope you have a very special and spooky Halloween season. And with that, let's get underway.
It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I want to know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I want to know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, a.k.a. Caliban, and you know how parents are, always showing up to try and serve you tea while you're trapped in a realm of thought a billion miles from home. Just text, Mom. Jeez. I'm joined on this episode by New York Times bestselling author Catherynne M. Valente. Catherynne is the Hugo and Locus award-winning author of over 24 novels, short stories, and novellas, as well as many other works of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, including the Orphan's Tales and the Fairyland series. Her most recent novel, Space Opera, was a 2019 Hugo Award nominee for Best Novel. The sequel, Space Oddity, is due out in 2021. Catherynne, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So great to have you here. Permission to come aboard granted. Today we'll be talking about Where No One Has Gone Before, the 6th episode of the first season of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Star Trek is not space opera, except when the Doctor is singing opera. But the mythical elements that underpin properties like Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, and Dune have no place in Gene Roddenberry's world of hard sci-fi and even harder atheism, except that one series that has a celestial temple filled with time-bending prophets. No, the Star Trek is an exploration of a universe that follows rational laws, give or take the occasional Apollo or Rumpelstiltskin. As the younger sibling of myth and fantasy, sci-fi is beholden to the tropes and archetypes of its forebears, substituting aliens for monsters and super science for magic, and why not, really? What is the Enterprise but a Homeric ship that our heroes steer into the odyssey of the unknown, sailing a sea of imagination and potential, and the odd Jack the Ripper now and again. But we'll talk about that a little later in the show. First, Catherynne, I always ask new guests on the show about their backstory and history with Trek. How did you become a Star Trek fan?
So my dad was into the original series. In fact, I do remember at one point when my little brother was born, a discussion about what his name was going to be. And his middle name is James to this day. But there were proposals that were more direct. And yeah. And then I remember watching the first couple of Next Gen episodes when they came out, and I was little. I was not a teenager or anything like that when Next Gen started airing, but I remember that really clearly. And then my boyfriend in high school or junior high and a little bit of high school was like a all-in Trekkie. Conventions, the whole thing. And like, I loved Star Trek. I didn't know there were conventions.
Yeah.
So that sort of opened that whole world up to me. And then, I think that probably a lot of people my age remember in the 90s that Next Gen was rerunning pretty much all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Like you could tune into a number of channels and find a Next Gen episode. But every night at 11 p.m., I think it was TNT was running them. And for like most of my college career, that was just my comfort watching. 11 o'clock, studying too much, Next Gen's on. And so I ended up watching all those episodes so many more times than I had even watched them in the original run. And I ended up doing the same thing with DS9. I don't even remember who was rerunning that, but that was the same thing where I just watched them over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of thread of particularly Next Gen and DS9, but I love the original series, and I have some warm spots for Voyager. I'm not an Enterprise girl. And I'm actually pretty into Discovery, honestly.
Yeah.
But like Next Gen and DS9, it's this sort of thread going through the better part of my sort of sentient life. I was 9 years old when Next Gen started airing. So it's been around for most of the time that I have been around those shows. And these days, my husband always knows if I'm feeling down because he'll hear the Next Gen music start playing. Because it just always makes me feel good. It's like a warm bath. Yes, of course, I know everything from every episode, but it's just like visiting old friends. It's a place to go.
TNG came in too at this time that was, because it was syndicated. So it was sort of breaking from the 3-network structure. And it sort of ran the table as far as that was concerned, because you could see it in first run in syndication, and also, of course, it was repeating in syndication. Now there are a million channels, and there's so many things to see that things get lost in the haze. But yeah, if you were looking for something that wasn't on the big 3, that was sci-fi, it was right there. And as you said, just playing all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. The 90s were a pretty good time for televised science fiction, honestly.
Yeah.
With Babylon 5 and everything getting started later on, and all of that.
Well, speaking of science fiction, and also Buffy was on at that time. I can't even remember when the X-Files, of course, which has both.
X-Files started in the sort of early mid 90s. So
who can remember now?
The funny thing is, I both sort of remember, but also know a lot of this because I'm a big Twin Peaks fan.
Oh, yeah.
And Twin Peaks actually presaged a lot of the sort of premiere television, the marquee television that we have nowadays, but it was a huge influence on X-Files. So I always remember that X-Files started right out like a year and a half after Twin Peaks ended.
Right. And David Duchovny on both of them, of course, as an FBI agent. Yeah.
Yep.
You write primarily in the genre of fantasy. You coined the term myth punk to describe your work and works like it. What distinguishes myth punk from fantasy?
Well, actually, the funny thing is, it's been a while since I've written fantasy. I've been hanging out in sci-fi for quite some time now. But if you look at my bibliography, there's definitely way more fantasy than science fiction.
A lot of fairies.
But so, the funny thing about myth punk is that that was a joke. that was a LiveJournal entry from way back in the day. It's literally just a paragraph long. And the paragraph says this, that there was a bunch of us at the time who were sort of up and coming writers who were doing a lot of work with folklore, fantasy, fairy tales, and mythology, and that we were sort of coming at it in this very postmodern kind of angry girl way.
Sure.
And that if we lived nearby and like got together at coffee shops, people would call it a movement. And then I made a joke because, of course, everything at the time was being coined punk, steampunk, cyberpunk, whatever. That it would be myth punk. Ha ha ha. And literally never thought about it again, except that people really picked it up and ran with it and found it a term that really described what they were trying to do. Yeah. And now there's been myth punk conventions, and people are very attached to the term. And I'm thrilled for that. I ended up writing this whole essay about punk music and the punk genres in speculative fiction. And I think that part of what I was trying to say there is that being punk about mythology was what we were doing. Yeah. That sort of DIY aesthetic and the sort of anger towards society and taking things apart and making them sort of part of your body and soul in that very punkish way.
Yeah.
I never intended, God, there's so many things in my career that I never intended
just
to be
accidents.
And they just turned out to be, but that happens to be one of them.
It's that focus on the punk part, that we see in cyberpunk, dieselpunk, whatever, where characters are living, on the outside or against the status quo or the institution. And it seems like a unique and postmodern direction for fantasy, which I think for the longest time was, about upholding societal norms. The evil so-and-so gets published. Maybe they get published. The evil so-and-so gets punished. The brave and noble are rewarded. And, you take that touchstone away in like a punk or a myth punk tale.
Yeah, and things do move in cycles, and in the 70s and 80s there were people who were doing that kind of thing as well with the Borderlands series and Bull and Terry Windling and all of those incredible writers. So it's not like it had never happened before, but I think it was happening in that sort of like late 2000s, early 2010s period in a slightly different way. And I think there were a lot of really techniques from literary fiction and realist fiction that were being brought in. Mm-hmm. If you look at something like Hal Duncan's Vellum, which is, practically a fantasy Ulysses, I think that there was just a new kind of breath blown into it.
Yeah. By that measure, I think Trek is probably closely or more closely related to fantasy than sci-fi sometimes, except for the philosophical navel-gazing and a little bit of violence. The characters of Trek, they're always noble, they're always upstanding, they're always rewarded at the conclusion of their quest or mission with, the panacea that their situation requires.
Yeah, I actually wrote an essay a while ago on Charlie Strauss's blog called Shit Cisco Says. And it was about the culture on these ships and on the DS9 station that, one thing that none of them ever foresaw was social media. Now, if you think about what Twitter would look like on DS9, there would be DS9 Twitter. It would be its own little microverse. Yeah. There'd be Slack channels.
Oh, yeah.
And it would be, I would love to see that brought into Discovery on some level, because it's hysterically funny how all of this would be brought into the culture of any of those locations. And like the hashtag Cisco Says would be amazing.
I love how Jake is a journalist and he's like, I've written my article, but I can't post it or publish it. It's like he would be live tweeting the Cardassian invasion. Yeah,
exactly. But they never foresaw what we really live in, this soup of social media now. But I think that one of the reasons that Star Trek has been so popular with us geeks, and I think that this applies particularly to Next Gen, but it's absolutely not only Next Gen, is that the crew are dorks.
Oh, yeah.
These are geeks. They are cosplaying like 19th century naval fiction and, doing LARPing like Sherlock Holmes and things
playing
like
the violin and the harpsichord and stuff. Yeah.
All of their hobbies are deeply geeky, and none of them are contemporary to their own time. Yeah. They're all geeks about our time.
Yeah.
And of course that is because of the limitations of writing far future science fiction, and that you want people to connect to these characters, so you give them contemporary to us cultural references, but it also, especially when you rewatch these things for the 7th or 8th time and your brain starts making weird connections, like they really is a ship of geeks.
Oh yeah. I also think it's an inheritance of just like earlier ideas of more traditional sci-fi, because the idea of like being a cyberpunk or just being a punk in fiction is being a rebel. And of course, all these characters come from, the tradition of like military science fiction from the 40s and 50s, where the rocket men are going to go out and colonize space and everything. And so I think that to have them do something really edgy, or untoward, wouldn't necessarily fit. And I don't know what the dividing line between like earlier, more mythical seeming sci-fi and modern sci-fi is. Like your Ray Bradbury's, your Roger Zelazny's, your Ursula Le Guin's, things seem more kind of dreamy and fantastic until we get to maybe, I don't know, cyberpunk or the atomic age or something. But I think a lot of early Trek sits on the far side of that line. In the original series, you had sci-fi greats like Harlan Ellison and Theodore Sturgeon, Norman Spenrad writing for it. And yet every other episode has mystical forces and godlike aliens messing with the crew and witches and black cats and Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, I think there's also an attempt to sort of make things truly alien. And at no point during the original series did they have the budget to make anything look, except maybe the Hortar, but like look genuinely alien. So I think some of these mystical things come in to represent technology that is, as Arthur C. Clarke said, indistinguishable from magic.
Yes,
and so I think that's a huge part of it. And I think that the episode we're about to talk about that's a big part of what the quote unquote magic is trying to do in that episode. And what you're talking about with the literary tradition, I do think there's sort of two tracks of science fiction, and one of them, there's always been like hard science fiction, if you want to call it that. I'm not even sure I want to call it hard science fiction, but science fiction that is really bound to a contemporary knowledge of science. And then there has been a track that is that sort of dreamy, fantastical, more experiential kind of science fiction that is exploring consciousness as its science to fictionalize,
Yeah.
And so I don't necessarily think there's a point at which it changes. I think that there's parallel evolution going on there.
Interesting. It seems like one side of it makes better TV shows. There's a lot of sci-fi shows. There's some fantasy shows and some that are really good, but it doesn't seem to be pushed quite as much as sci-fi on TV.
I mean, I feel like all the time. All the time. In the 21st century, I feel like you end up with these shows that start out saying, like Battlestar Galactica, they start out saying they're going to be really hard science fiction and gritty and realistic, and they always end up with God and angels by the end.
They can't pretend anymore.
They try hard, but they always end up in the same place.
Well, all those things considered, how thick do you consider the lines between fantasy and sci-fi to be painted?
I think that they can be as thick or as thin as you want them to be. I think that, sticking with your mission statement, I think that it's one of the flaws of Discovery, and I quite enjoy Discovery, but I think Discovery doesn't stick with its mission statement. Like, it presents itself as it's going to be this gritty, realistic version of Star Trek, but it's the least scientific Star Trek we've ever had.
Yeah.
And so I think that, if you start out with a mission statement of one way, you should probably try to stay away from the angels or try to stay away from the grit. But it's all about the story in the end. It's all about whether you were true to the premise of the story and explored the most interesting part of it. If it's entertaining, no one really cares.
Well, that's absolutely true. Speaking of the blurring of those lines, your novel Radiance is a fascinating mashup of ideas, taking the Victorians colonized the solar system setting of a Jules Verne or a Space 1889 and fast forwarding it to an alternate universe, 1986, where the silent film era is still going on, and it's also kind of a murder mystery, and it's also about cinema and narrative. And how do you, when you're adding elements and you're mashing up genres, how do you say enough? Like, do you ever think like this might be too much?
There is an outline of Radiance floating around my hard drive somewhere where it literally says, "Am I over egging the pudding here?" Maybe not all.
Never listen to that voice.
And in the end, I was like, "But I want all those things. Like,
Sure.
this is the whole point of me doing this. Like, why am I torturing myself over this structure and all of that if I'm not going to include all the stuff that I want to include?"
Yeah.
So I was really interested in that old pulp golden age science fiction where all the planets were inhabitable, but I'm interested in the future of that. What happens when we've colonized all those inhabitable planets? What does the fully lived in solar system look like?
Yeah.
And I was really interested in the Jules Vernean science fiction that you were talking about. Well, okay, but what does that look like 100 years down the line? And so a lot of it is just pushing the premise of a subgenre a century on and seeing what that turns out like. And then there is this murder mystery at the or maybe not murder at the core of it, and all of this stuff about movies, and the way the movies came into it. This started out as a short story, and the original plan of the short story was just the pulp planets and the Victoriana stuff. But I had read an interview with Mark Danielewski, who wrote House of Leaves, which is one of my favorite novels. And he was talking about his father being a cinematographer and how much that had affected him as a writer. Well, my dad went to film school, and when I was a very young child was trying to make it as an independent filmmaker. And I realized that though that had had a huge effect on me as a child and as an artist, I had never really written about it. So there's this whole father-daughter relationship that's all based around movies and the lens and camera and all of it. And it's all actually terribly personal if you know my father and my relationship, but if you don't, it just seems quite literary. But yeah, so Radiance is definitely the science fiction version of everything, including the kitchen sink.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to your future Star Trek novel featuring a father and a daughter and a brother with a totally normal name.
Never say never.
I
have a Minecraft tie-in coming out in November.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so, on that note, switch gears. You wrote a Mass Effect Andromeda novel last year. Yeah, that's arguably a space opera setting. It definitely has relatively hard sci-fi. Were you familiar with the franchise before working on it?
I'm a huge fan of Mass Effect.
Awesome.
I am a massive fan of Mass Effect.
Sure.
So I pursued that. My agent was like, "Oh, why do you want to do a tie-in? Like, I hate it. Why are you doing this? Why are you making me make this deal?" I'm like, "Because I love it and I want to."
Make the call.
He's like, "It's not even like, they don't pay very well." I'm like, "I don't care." So yeah, I really wanted to do it because I was evangelizing to everybody I met about Mass Effect, and I just love the game so much. And part of the reason that I love it is it kind of gave me that watching Star Trek for the first time feeling,
Yeah.
And so mine is called Annihilation, and it's actually quite hard science fiction, which was part of the sort of assignment from BioWare. They wanted me to sort of strip down the available technology in a kind of The Martian Mass Effect way.
Okay.
Like the Martian was specifically mentioned. I'm like, huh.
Okay. All
so
right.
You want Mass Effect without the technology? That's going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
So like one of the first things I had to do was come up with a way to hamstring all of that high tech.
Yeah.
So Annihilation is actually kind of a classic locked room mystery.
Okay,
There's
cool.
a plague that's released on the ship, and they don't have the technology to just press a button and scan and find out what's going on. So,
Right.
all of the sort of various skills from these aliens' weird lives have to come into play to even do something as basic as an autopsy.
Okay. And this is another narrative, too, like our episode today, where you've got humans leaving our galaxy and exploring a different one. Yeah.
And so they're completely without help out in the middle of nowhere. So I mean, in a lot of ways, it kind of was my chance to write a Star Trek kind of story, because God, how many episodes are there in Next Gen where everybody, like, somebody's alone on the ship, or the power starts getting shut down, or the sort of lonely person on the ship is a Next Gen staple.
I can't wait till I'm a famous author and I can force my agent to get me a video game tie-in. We have to talk about your recent novel, Space Opera, which revolves around an intergalactic talent contest, which is based on Eurovision. And I have to confess, embarrassingly, I know that Eurovision's been around since the 50s, but I and most of America, I think, are fairly unfamiliar with it.
Yeah, there's no reason to be embarrassed. Americans don't know. That's fine. I was in Ireland for Worldcon, and it was awesome to like go to a reading and not have to explain to everybody what Eurovision is.
Okay, sure.
So Eurovision is it's kind of like if you combine like the X Factor and Miss Universe and World War One.
That last one there, okay.
No. It'll come in. So every year, all the countries in most of the countries in Europe, plus a few these days that are not in Europe, like Australia, send a singer or a band to whatever country won it the previous year, and there's like a battle of the bands. And everybody wears insane costumes. It's sort of trashy Europop music. Not always, though. It's quite a nice ballad that won this year. And it's just this incredible show. Like, honestly, if you want to know what... I've written a number of articles saying this is how to watch Eurovision, but if you want to just watch one song and know why I had to write a science fiction novel about it, watch Australia's entry from this year, which is called Zero Gravity, and it's amazing.
Okay.
So the World War One thing comes in because there's voting from home and there's jury voting. And the rule with both of those is that you can't vote for your own country.
Oh.
So you get a lot of these alliance voting that ends up kind of being a snapshot of European politics for the year. And like there's kind of an Eastern Bloc voting. There's whether or not a particular country has a large diaspora of people who have immigrated to other countries in Europe tends to be a huge factor.
Okay.
This is why people think Australia may never win, because there are not a bunch of Australians living anywhere else.
Right.
You know. So yeah, it's a totally fascinating. I absolutely love it. It is massively popular. Americans do not realize how popular this thing is. 200 million people watch it every year.
We're missing out.
Yeah, we are. Also, we should never be part of it because we wouldn't understand the not voting for our own country.
I guess. And who would vote for America? Everybody would team up against us.
But the thing is that no one votes for the UK. It's kind of a running joke.
Okay.
Nil point, no points is kind of the running gag with the United Kingdom. So obviously the band that goes out to try and save Earth in my book Space Opera is a British band.
Okay, sure. Perfect.
A little side Eurovision joke for the true fans.
I love that the aliens that invite Earth to participate in the contest suggest we could send maybe Yoko Ono or Skrillex or the guy from that movie, Henry VIII. You know, it reminds me of a scene in Doctor Who where in the year 5 billion, aliens want to play a classic Earth song to commemorate the planet's destruction, and they play Toxic by Britney Spears. Yeah. Like they don't have any context, so they're making these questionable choices in our society.
Well, and the thought in my head was, what sounds good to an alien ear? It's not going to be the 3-chord thing that is popular here on Earth. It's going to be, some weird Japanese lady screaming into a microphone.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, there's a lot of sort of jokes like that. It is very much a love letter to pop music as well as a love letter to science fiction. There are as many jokes about obscure musical things as there are about obscure tropes in science fiction.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
So can we confirm then sequel coming out 2021 or soon?
2021. Yeah.
That sounds good.
Space Out.
Well, I'd love to keep talking about your work. I'm going to talk about the Refrigerator Monologues and SF Squeakcast, but Star Trek.
Space Oddity does have a sort of Star Trek tie-in, though. When it comes out in 2021, you can remember that I said there's a Star Trek thing in it.
Right. Exactly. We got to talk about Star Trek. So let's get to it. When we were looking for an episode to cover, I didn't want to pigeonhole you as, quote unquote fantasy writer. So obviously we have to talk about something that is related to myth and magic, but not exactly. I thought it would be an interesting exercise to explore the mythopoetic elements that often come up in Star Trek. I mentioned before, I thought that TOS was often exploring these spaces. And of course, the early days of TNG were steered by many of the same writers and producers that worked on the original series. And many season 1 and 2 TNG episodes feel like TOS episodes. And the episode that we're talking about today, I think, is at the top of that list.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really early episode. It's only
Yeah.
episode 5. So you're talking about a cast that hasn't like fully gelled yet and characters that aren't fully themselves. I think, Worf is sort of barely recognizable.
Yeah, and Captain Picard has got that sort of
he's
whipping
pissed
back
off
and
at
forth
everybody.
thing. Yeah, right, yeah.
He's so mean. He's really mean in this episode. And Riker's kind of mean too. This is definitely fully in the everyone is just a dick to Wesley all the time
Yeah, shut up,
section.
Jen. Yeah.
And it does very much feel like an original series episode, coming not very far after, the actual rip-off TOS episode where Yara and Data sleep together.
Right.
Yeah, so it's definitely it's an interesting episode too, because it comes back in a big way in Wesley's story in his final episode. So it is sort of planting something that comes back in later on, which is not all that common back in this very episodic kind of era of television.
Yeah, it is nice that Wesley, and we'll talk about his character as we go on here, but as a character, he does get a little arc there that I kind of would want to, I'm sure it's been resolved or at least expanded on in extended media, but, where does he go? What happens to him?
I'm sure that there's extended media about it. I'm positive there is, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't know how much that tradition really continues in later Trek, even in later TNG. As the show and the franchise goes on, I think it gets more practical and more political and more interested in picking at the idea of the utopia.
Except for all the prophet stuff in DS9,
yes,
which is very similar to this in a lot of ways.
That's true. Yeah. DS9, has this planet that worships time traveling aliens, but even that I think takes a backseat in later seasons to the political maneuvering and the military storylines and examining those social issues that Trek likes to pick apart.
Yeah.
I think on DS9, they, Cisco becomes alien Jesus at the end, basically.
For sure.
And it's like the end. It's like the last episode. And I think if you start the last season with him becoming alien Jesus, and then we're dealing with that, you got a stew going.
Yeah, I rewatched DS9 for the nth time not too long ago, and I was really disappointed with that they wait to pull the trigger on that to the end, because you kind of knew that's probably where they were going to go with it, but there's no notion of what happens after that and where he goes, what his experience is. And I know that there's novels about it, but I just would really like to have seen that happen and then see it play out, see how the characters respond to somebody who can show up anywhere. I mean, there's no longer any sort of mortal coil to hold him back. Yeah. So he could have turned up at any point. He could turn up in Discovery for all we know.
Yeah, there are all these suggestions that is, the next frontier, even in this episode, that humans will one day achieve something like that. Q insinuates that. And so here we have a couple examples of that happening, but it maybe just falls outside of the purview of the series, I guess, because we never really explore that.
I mean, and the funny thing about this episode is it's a pretty great premise. And then what you find out is that the crew of the Enterprise has kind of shitty imaginations.
Yeah, that's not that great.
Where thought becomes reality, and it's just like a couple of kitty cats and Picard's mom. It's really, and I love that at the end when they're like, everyone has to think really hard and believe in fairies so we can get home. Like, not one person is like, hold on, I got to imagine some stuff before we go.
Right? Yeah. First of all, there's
all
fire.
These people who have got to be addicted to the holodeck at this point are not.
Oh boy, yeah, that's a whole other show.
Can we just put this off for like an hour? Just...
yeah. Everybody be good. Nobody think of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Come on.
Exactly.
Well, we're talking about Where No One Has Gone Before. Like I said, it's the 6th episode of the first season of Star Trek, The Next Generation. It first aired on October 26th of 1987, and it was written by Diane Duane and Michael Reeves. Diane Duane has been mentioned on this show before. She's an accomplished fantasy and science fiction writer, having penned many tie-in novels and original works of fiction, including the Young Wizards series of YA novels, as well as the Rihansu series of Star Trek books. And as a screenwriter, she's written for such shows as Batman the Animated Series, Gargoyles, My Little Pony, DuckTales, and more. Michael Reeves is also an accomplished SFF writer and screenwriter, having written for live-action series like Buck Rogers, the 80s reboot of The Twilight Zone, The Father Dowling Mysteries, and more. He's worked on animated series like Gargoyles and My Little Pony as well, The Real Ghostbusters, and Batman, for which he received a 1993 Emmy Award for Outstanding Writing. He's the author of over 40 novels and short stories, and he's the co-author of the Interworld trilogy with Neil Gaiman and his own daughter, author Mallory Reeves. The episode is directed by Rob Bowman. This episode was one of Bowman's first credits as a television director and his first episode of TNG, although he would go on to direct 13 episodes of the series in total. He's had a prolific career in television and film. He was a longtime director and producer on The X-Files, as well as the ABC series Castle, and he directed the X-Files feature film in 1998, as well as the films Elektra and Reign of Fire.
Wow.
The stardate for this episode is 41263.1. And your assignment, Catherynne, if you can, is to give us a 25-word synopsis of Where No Man Has Gone Before. Excuse me, Where No One Has Gone Before.
There's a visit from corporate, new efficiency expert, turns up with his assistant, screws everything up. The assistant turns out to be a time-traveling alien, takes them to where thought becomes reality. Everyone has a freak out and then goes home.
I love that great mundane reading of it. Because the guy from corporate's a jerk. His assistant does all the work. Yada, yada, yada.
Totally. I think that's probably what the actor was thinking of, because that's exactly the air he comes in with.
Yeah.
He's of course the character that you're designed to hate from the beginning.
Oh yeah.
So he's arrogant to everybody.
But even he gets a little empathy at the end, because the traveler's like, he got close, and then he asks him to help, and because he's like, me.
Well, one of the things I do like about it is about his character is that he says partway through the episode that he did think it was him. He wasn't like enslaving some alien and passing off and running a scam. He really thought that he was doing something. Yeah. I think that's a little more complex and human than I think that probably the original series would have, with Mudd and everything, would have had somebody who knew it wasn't him.
Right, yeah. He's just totally overestimating his abilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, a visit from corporate.
Yeah.
But, the really important thing we have to talk about, though, is this is one of the classic Wesley sweaters.
Oh, my goodness, yeah.
Oh, my God, what is it? It's the peach one that has, ruched fabric between the knitted fabric.
And shoulder pads, and
shoulder pads. It is a woman's sweater.
It's just from his mom's closet.
It's from Aunt Taylor's loft. No joke. And has, I swear, the fabric between the knitted fabric is like sateen or something like that. It is like one of my top 2 Wesley sweaters.
You can't be a star child human messiah and wear a sweater like that. Sorry.
Absolutely not.
The story for this episode was loosely based on Diane Duane's first Star Trek novel, The Wounded Sky, which is set in the original series era. Writer and future series head writer Maurice Hurley rewrote the script several times, and according to Duane, the finished product bears little resemblance to their original script. Music plays a really big part in this episode. The imaginary string quartet that we see is playing an arrangement of the first movement of Eine kleine Nachtmusik by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The ballerina is seen dancing to a composition entitled Waltz of the Chocolate Donut. It was composed by series composer Ron Jones, who also scored the rest of the episode. And the music is chef's kiss, is very solid in this episode. It's beautiful. It does a lot of the storytelling work. And the episode was in fact nominated for an Emmy Award for sound mixing on a drama series in 1988. This is the first episode in which the pool table is present in engineering. That's the central table console that would be seen for the rest of the series. It's the first episode it was used, but it was first seen in The Last Outpost, which was shot after this episode but aired before. This is also the last appearance of the corridor in the back of the engineering office area. That's a little glassed-in area where Geordi sits and does stuff. That corridor would disappear until it reappeared later in Star Trek Generations, so maybe the Traveler took it with him. This is, of course, the episode where Wesley Crusher receives his acting ensign commission. The bad sweaters would continue, however, for several episodes until he gets his rainbow-shouldered episode that, of course, everyone knows and loves. It's stated in this episode by Kozinski that by 2364, the time of this episode, Starfleet had charted just 11% of the galaxy. And on the subject of other galaxies, the Enterprise travels to M33, or the Triangulum galaxy in this episode, literally where no one has gone before at this point in the series. It's stated that a return trip to the Milky Way would take the Enterprise 300 years. This figure is a reference to the original series episode By Any Other Name, in which aliens from the Andromeda Galaxy hijack the Enterprise and attempt to travel home on a journey that would take 300 years with the modifications that they make to the Enterprise's engines. So clearly, Starfleet engine technology and efficiency has improved to Kelvin levels by the 24th century. Let's talk about some of the guest stars in this episode. Eric Menyuk appears as the Traveler in this episode. Menyuk would go on to appear 2 more times on TNG as the Traveler in the episodes Remember Me and Journey's End. And Menyuk was on the short list of actors being considered for the role of Lieutenant Commander Data before it was offered to Brent Spiner. He worked with series producer Bob Justman to develop a style of speech and action for the Traveler that would make him seem more alien. His makeup was designed by designer Michael Westmore, and he retired from acting in 1998, and he's now an attorney who specializes in representing children with disabilities.
Wow. I think he's really great in the episode. Genuinely, like it's a really lovely piece of acting. Yeah. That speech pattern is really nice. I mean, I think that there's a reason people feel quite warmly toward this character, and it's because he does have this feeling of sort of beneficent warmth about him. Yeah,
he's a little touchy, but he does.
Yeah, he's a little,
probably
a
close
HR.
Talker.
Call HR, but immediately drawn to the young man on the in the room, and is very huggy. So, but aliens have different. He sees Wesley for his aura, I guess.
Yes, right. He knows how to pick them. Yeah, I was reading an interview with him in Starlog magazine at the time, and he talked about how they had worked hard to make him seem alien, but not weird. They didn't want it to be like they wanted to be relatable, but yet kind, as you said. And I think they achieved that. There's also an anecdote that's crazy in that interview. He's talking about how after the show was on, he was in a liquor store or something like that, in LA, and a kid saw him and said, are you the Traveler? And he's like, yeah, I played the Traveler. And he's like, oh, you were really great. And he's like, oh, thanks. And then later the kid's like, can you come to my house? My mom doesn't love me.
Oh no!
And he's like, whoa. And he had to sit down and kind of talk to the kid and everything. And he realized that people are, he was glad that his character seemed like somebody, approachable and somebody that could help people.
Well, I was going to say, he's kind of like Cosmic Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
A little bit. So I kind of get why the kid would be like, that seems like a dad.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Be my space dad.
Oh boy.
Yikes.
Well, yeah, but anyway, but
no,
now
I think he's really great.
Yeah, he is really great, and I'm glad that he as well kind of gets a sort of long arc, but we get to see him again. Stanley Kamel plays Kaczynski in the episode. The late actor was a ubiquitous presence on TV from the 70s until his death in 2008. Apart from Star Trek, he's best known as Dr. Charles Kroger, the psychiatrist of Adrian Monk on the titular series.
Huh.
I never watched Monk.
I did not realize that. I never really watched Monk. It's one of those things that's always on at your mom's house.
Yes, right.
It's not my genre of TV. So, but I wonder if I watched it, if I would have been like, that guy looks vaguely familiar.
Yeah. I have a crazy theory that I want to pitch, my crackpot theory here early in the show about the character of Kaczynski and his relationship to Menyuk, or the Traveler. In this episode, we've got a fraud scientist named Kaczynski. Jerzy Kaczynski is also the name of an author who wrote a famous Holocaust autobiographical novel called The Painted Bird about his experiences in World War II. It was revealed years later that the book was kind of a James Frey job. He was a Jew in Europe, but he didn't have the experiences of the character in the novel. He was fortunate enough to have a safe place to live and stay. So, also kind of a fraud. The scientist in the episode has an assistant called the Traveler. Traveler is also a slang term for Romani peoples like Gypsy. The Traveler has an eccentric appearance. He's got a pronounced nose and brow line. He suffers and does all the work at the behest of Kaczynski. The Traveler dresses in a striped sort of uniform that is, at least in my feverish mind, reminiscent of the striped outfits that concentration camp inhabitants wore. So I don't know if Maury Hurley's doing something here, but it seems...
I mean, that adds up to me. Of course, there were a lot of Jewish writers and actors involved in Star Trek in every series. That seems like a lot of coincidences.
It's a lot of coincidences. I mean, it's a cool name. Yeah, and it's...
Sure, but, there's a lot of cool names.
But the first thing you Google is not that guy that comes up. It's like this guy. So I just thought that was really, really weird.
That's really interesting.
Probably huge coincidence. A Heard Aware appears in the episode as Yvette Picard, and she got her start on Broadway in 1935, appearing alongside her husband Will Geer in Let Freedom Ring. She made her on-screen debut in 1978, and she'd go on to appear in films such as Cocoon and its sequel, Critters 2, Practical Magic, and Cruel Intentions. Biff Yeager appears in the episode as Lieutenant Commander Argyle. He would also appear in the episode Datalore. Yeager has appeared in many roles on the big and small screens since his debut in 1974, appearing most recently in a 2019 episode of the series Baskets. TNG, as you probably know, had something of a revolving door for chief engineers in its first season, and Yeager was apparently in consideration for a recurring role as Argyle as the series continued, except, allegedly, according to Will Wheaton, he was let go by the producers of the show after the show was hit with a lot of Chief Argyle fan mail praising his performance for episodes that had yet to air.
Ooh.
So he got the timing wrong on that one.
Yeah.
And apparently him soliciting people to write in was not cool with the management. I have another theory. This one's more fun than the last one. Relax. Before we settled on Geordi LaForge as chief engineer in season 2, there were, of course, 4 characters presented as chief engineer. And I think each of them is a joke callback to Scotty from the original series.
Argyle.
Yes, the first one we see is Lieutenant Commander Sarah McDougal. That's self-explanatory. We've, of course, got Argyle. The third is Lieutenant Logan. Logan is a Scottish name derived from Lagan. It's maybe stretching a little. And the fourth one we see is Lieutenant Commander Leland Lynch. And Lynch is an Irish name, so maybe this is running out of steam. But you can't have Chief Engineer Haggis, so what are you going to do? The guy who almost gets burned by the imaginary fire is longtime series stunt coordinator Dennis Matalone. This is his first appearance on screen. And finally, Emmy Lou appears in the episode as Worf's childhood Targ. Emmy Lou was a Russian wild boar, and the Targ costume was designed by series costumer William Ware Tice. No word on who played the cat in the episode.
It looks a lot like Spot, that cat.
It does. Yeah, they must have had a stable of orange tabbies that they went to. Yeah. Talking about the episode proper, Wesley is a divisive character in Star Trek fandom, which is the understatement of the year. I mean, he's certainly important to the writers of TNG. You can tell in early seasons, but fans tend to find him annoying.
Here's the funny thing. I said I was 9 when this show started airing, right?
Yeah.
So I never knew until Will Wheaton started talking about it way later that Wesley Crusher was controversial.
Hated. Yeah.
I was a child who was not on Usenet. And the 2 things I was excited about, other than new Star Trek, was that the guy from Reading Rainbow was going to be on it, and Will Wheaton, who I had a huge crush on from the movies, was going to be on it.
Right.
Like, I had my tiger beat with Will Wheaton on the cover, you know?
That's a collector's item, yeah.
Oh, for sure. And, like, I loved Wesley. I am, like, the poster child for what the idea of Wesley was, that you're going to bring in young viewers who are going to love sort of the fantasy of the kid being the one that solves the mystery all the time.
Right.
As an adult, I'm like, why is the kid, given that the best and brightest are on the Enterprise, why is this little kid always have the answers? But as a kid, I was like, obviously, because I too am a genius who would be great in space. Yeah. This totally tracks with everything I want the future to be. So I never knew that until way later that anybody had a problem with Wesley, because I was totally in love with him.
I kind of go back and forth on like what kids want to see in their stories, because I think that a lot of stories aimed at kids feature kid heroes, but also there's a lot of like adult heroes that kids identify with. Like, do kids want to be Luke Skywalker, or do they want to be pod racing Anakin? And I think they can do both. You know, I know when I was younger and watching Star Trek, I liked Wesley. If you told me that people hated Wesley, I wouldn't have understood. But I did wonder why he was the guy that saved the ship all the time.
Yeah, like I read for younger readers as well, for middle grade and YA readers. And I think that this episode does one thing that will always get a kid interested, which is that Wesley tries to tell everyone what's going on, and they refuse to listen to him, but he's right. So every kid has that experience, whether they're right or wrong in the end, has the experience of trying to point something out and the adults aren't listening. And so that is something that instantly speaks to a child's experience, and that sense of injustice that is so much a part of everyone's childhood, no matter what your cultural or socioeconomic class is. That feeling of injustice is the universal feeling of childhood.
That's interesting.
And so any kid recognizes that situation where they see something that the adults don't see and no one will listen to them. And what the kid wants, the fantasy fulfillment, is that they're right. Now, the kid isn't always right. Sometimes they just, want to point out that there was a pretty butterfly and everyone else is trying to do something
right.
important. But in this case, the pretty butterfly was a time-traveling alien and everybody should listen to Wesley.
Yeah.
So there is this sort of child or adolescent, really, wish fulfillment in what happens here, in that not only is Wesley right, but he's special.
That's, yeah.
And though he should never be told he's special, they make a big point of that so that he doesn't turn into a dick. He is somebody that should be listened to. And I think that is something that's speaks very powerfully to people who are maybe a little bit younger than Wesley. So they sort of look at him as someone they might grow up into, which is definitely the age I was at when this episode aired.
Yeah. He takes it in stride, and, finding out that you're, the Mozart of space and time and the chosen one or whatever, it never really makes him have a big head. I like the fact that the Traveler's like, don't tell anybody about this, though. And then at the end of the episode, Picard's like, wow, that's really cool. So he broke that rule there. A lot of fantasy stories, and to be fair, space opera and sci-fi stories have a chosen one narrative. You want your protagonist to be special and the person who has the guile or aptitude to succeed in the narrative. But you don't want them to come off as, being infallible or a Mary Sue type character. How do you balance that in your work?
Well, I mean, I think you can look at Wesley for the answer to this, although I don't necessarily think the show always knows it. Wesley screws up a lot.
That's true.
Like a lot. Though, like that episode about the nanites that happens later on. So yeah, he's a genius who invented nanites. He nearly destroys everything with it. And it's not, it's not a great move on his part. The way that you make Not a Mary Sue is you make them screw up. Yeah. Everything can't go their way.
Yeah.
It's fine to have that sort of wish fulfillment of the injustice being answered and being right, but nobody likes a character who's right all the time. And it's not an interesting character to watch either. So you have to see them. There's no arc if they're always right. So you have to see them develop from one thing to another, whether that's your classic training montage or not. And you have to see them be wrong. You have to see the plan not work. You have to see them fail. And the thing is that we all have the experience of failing. So I think that Mary Sue characters get created when writers are afraid to have their protagonist fail because they think it makes them unlikable. But in fact, we love people who fail as long as, they get back up again, because we've all failed. It makes them more relatable. It makes them more human. And it makes us able to sort of map that experience onto our own lives, which is one of the sort of magics of reading.
Yeah. And there's a long-standing trope of the character in a fantasy tale or a sci-fi or a fairy story screwing something up and then having to fix it. The sort of sorcerer's apprentice thing with the nanites and having to right what was wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, this is part of why Wesley becomes less controversial as he goes along. Obviously, he grows up as well and starts wearing a normal uniform and everything. Yeah. But he becomes less of an annoying character the more he screws up and learns how to fix his own problems. And so people like him a lot more by the time he leaves. Even though that episode, oh my God, is that a problematic episode? The episode where Wesley leaves.
Yes.
he is a much more liked character than he is in this first season, where he really isn't ever wrong. In this first season, he's just Wesley Crusher, space genius. Right. and that's what annoys people, for adults tuning in that wanted to see their adult science fiction, to have this, little kid who is always chirping at everybody and then always turns out to be right, was deeply irritating to them. It is neither Wesley, the fictional character, nor Will Wheaton's fault. It's the Jar Jar effect, essentially.
Oh boy, please don't cross the streams. I was ruminating on the sort of fantasy tropes that you see often in sci-fi and even in Trek, and this episode is dinging a lot of them. You've got the Traveler, who I see as this idea of a space elf almost, this sort of different sort of race that's more enlightened, has weird sort of body features. Also, it sort of is like a fairy godfather to Wesley in a lot of ways, comes in and tells him that he's special and he's got his back, and then shows up in times of trouble, in later on in the series.
Yeah, he's like Jiminy Cricket.
Yeah, there you go.
And even the effects wise, like I have to say that this is a beautiful episode, and it must have looked amazing back when it first aired. The way that some television shows look like movies every week these days, we've kind of gotten used to that. Yeah. But this must have looked incredible to air in 1989. Like it just must have been amazing. And one of the effects is clearly bubbles. It's clearly soap bubbles. It looks great. The lighting on the bubbles makes it look super mystical and everything, but that is a really common fantasy film technique.
Yeah.
You can see it in Legend and Dark Crystal and all of those great fantasy movies when the bubbles float through. But you can light those things in 100 ways to make them look like will-o'-the-wisps or in whatever they are supposed to be in this episode.
I read that the effects guy did that in his basement. Like he just put like a pool or kiddie pool down there and then shot that stuff.
Yeah, no, it looks great. It looks fantastic.
You mentioned before the Traveler, the idea of Kaczynski sort of, enslaving him or using him. And I thought of like a genie in that case. Although he's not really... there's the threat of something bad happening for how he uses this guy. But of course, then the genie, the Traveler in this case, is the solution to the problem as well.
We never really know much about this character. No. And it seems like he's really being harmed by the end of this, and then he's just gone. But we don't know if he just like burned out a corporeal form and had to get another one or what. Like we never really find out what happened. He just sort of kind of exits stage left.
Yeah.
Pursued by bubbles. But it's definitely that kind of Yoda or going into the West, like in Lord of the Rings feeling of, the enlightened other species does its work and then passes into the next phase of being, so to speak. He doesn't feel like he's dead, but he's definitely like not there. And so it's a surprise when he turns up again later on.
I'm ascending, and I will come back when you need me.
Which happens a lot in Next Gen, actually. There are a number of episodes where someone phases out of gross matter and into the next stage.
Yeah, for a show that is supposed to be atheistic or at least agnostic, there are a lot of these sort of energy or spiritual aliens. There's a lot of like... sort of reassurance that things are going to be okay, like that you would get, from a faith or a religion.
Yeah. I mean, Wesley says something in the beginning when he's talking to the Traveler about like the Traveler says, "Oh, what do these equations say?" And Wesley's like, "That time and matter are not as intricately linked as we think." Yeah. I think that's what those equations say. Do they, Wesley? Do they say that?
Yeah, no.
I don't think so. But
yeah.
Sure.
And in that way, he's kind of he's sort of testing his character, sort of a threshold guardian. Yeah. You brought up before the idea of thinking happy thoughts and, clapping for the fairies to give him strength, which I think that the show might have been better served by doubling down on and pointing out how sort of ridiculous it is. At one point, Kaczynski, I think, says, "This is crazy. This sounds like magic." And the Traveler's like, "Yeah, I guess it would seem like magic. Ever heard of Arthur C. Clarke?"
Yeah.
But having Picard really be like, "I can't, just say clap for fairies," or just say, to rational people, this doesn't make any sense. But apparently time, thought, and space, are one. And so we can help this guy by putting our noble exploratory spirits, in behind him to get us home.
Yeah. Look, ain't no shame in the game. Doctor Who does it as well.
Oh, yeah.
Tinkerbell Doctor. So, like, it is a goofy trope, but given what the episode is set up as its premise, it is logical. It follows logically. I think it's honest to the premise. So it doesn't feel quite as cheesy to me as it might, because that clearly must be some kind of solution if indeed we are where we seem to be, and that is true. I think if this episode were being reshot today, you would go through a whole montage of different crew members and like the fantasies that they're trying to ignore while this happens. But of course, you're talking about something with much less budget and I mean, I think it's hard for people to understand what the rules of television were in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. Like, if you go back and there's so much on streaming now, you can watch these. They're much more like plays, episodes of these shows, of any show in the 80s. They're much more like plays than they are like movies. And now they feel more like hour-long movies. But then it's just, it's, the stationary camera. There's not a lot of experimentation in structure. Actually, I think Farscape, despite...
Oh, boy. Okay, all right. She did it. I didn't do it. I always talk about Farscape on this show.
Oh, Farscape's my favorite. I love Farscape so much. And I mean, it's not... I haven't seen it nearly as many times because it is so emotionally brutal compared to Star Trek. I'm not going to roll up and watch Season of Death. But I think that Farscape did a huge amount to influence writers as to what you could do with shipboard science fiction structure. In a 42-minute episode. But we weren't there yet. We were really just at the beginning of television beginning to evolve into its own medium, and a medium with a very different set of rules than any other. So you're still talking about the late 80s, where you have, what else is airing is Golden Girls, Roseanne. No, I'm not talking about genre. Those are great shows. I'm talking about the structure of an episode, of any given show, and what the rules of that episode were. So at no point in any show that aired at this time were you going to have a montage of a bunch of different characters and what they're going through as a climax to an episode, characters you might never see again. That's just not really how things worked at how you created an emotional climax at the time. You focused in on a tight close-up of your main characters, especially since you're only on episode 5, and people probably don't even remember what their names are at this point. And you have the protagonist, in this case, was very much being presented as Picard rather than necessarily an ensemble. Tell you what the rules are, and then everybody believes really hard, and it gets resolved. It gets resolved in 42 minutes, always. So even having that traveler come back in the 2 other episodes that it does was beginning to really look at different ways of using episodic television. And of course, the episode Family that comes right after Best of Both Worlds, where Picard becomes Locutus, is the first time in any Star Trek that there is an entire episode devoted to the emotional fallout of what had happened. Run on
continuity,
And people, you can talk to people who are critics of television professionally, and they will talk about that episode as one of the first to start to delve into the emotional ramifications of episodes that would have just been left to be their own little bubble universe in previous series.
Right.
And so I think that the way you would shoot this episode now would be just drastically different.
If you're in a bubble universe, the Traveler can help you, by the way. Okay, all right. So listeners, she did it. She brought up Farscape. So I got to rewind a little bit to Farscape. I've always thought of Farscape as kind of an anti-Trek, not anti in that we oppose it, but it's like an answer to Trek, because the way that Trek structures its narratives and the way that they want to solve problems, Farscape will get to the Star Trek solution at the end of the second act. It won't work, and then they're forced to improvise over the course of the rest of the show to find some solution to the problem that will absolutely require a sacrifice, and not everything will be reset, at the end of the episode. And it's about finding those like hard choices and living with them. If you get 2 Rikers on Star Trek, that one of those Rikers is either dead or is going to leave by the end of the show. Whereas on Farscape, you get 2 Crichtons, and that's the next, 6 months of your show is exploring 2 Crichtons.
Yeah, no, and look, I love Farscape, and I actually, I will controversially say it is my favorite science fiction television show. But here's why I will watch Next Gen all the time, and my favorite science fiction television show I will not. Because Farscape does all of the things we're talking about. It absolutely explores the emotional ramifications of everything. Everything is a lot weirder. It's a lot darker. Starfleet is one guy, and he screws up constantly. And the emotional payoff that you as a fan want is held absolutely as long as humanly possible before it's paid off. It is brutal to watch this show outside of season 1. Season 1 is, very much like a lot of other episodic science fiction. There are great episodes in it, but the weakest episodes of the show are all in season 1 as well. And it's kind of trying to be Star Trek in that way. But outside of season 1, I don't want to put myself through that again. It is just a lot. It's a lot to deal with. If you have any sort of issues with depression, season 3 is just not something you should ever put an episode on. It's really rough. Whereas Next Gen is never going to ask that of me. It is, it'll put my heart through the ringer for 10 minutes of the episode, and then things will be okay. And like that's why it's comfort watching for me. That's why I can recite a lot more of Star Trek than I can of Farscape, even though I think that Farscape is a huge jump forward in televised science fiction. Star Trek wants to hug me and tell me that everything's going to be okay. Farscape is like, nothing's going to be okay. Fuck you.
But
but beautifully and greatly.
Yes.
Farscape is wonderful, and it is truly space opera, I think.
Oh yeah, I agree.
But my God, like there's only so much of that I can deal with.
And that's what Trek wants to do. Like you said, I think it wants to hug you and tell you that, we're going to make it. That optimism is even in like Discovery, which in its 2 seasons goes to some really dark places. It always comes back and says, but we're going to make it because we're better and we're closer connected than they are.
Yeah, I don't think Gene Roddenberry would be mad to hear me say that.
No.
Like, I think that that's what he wanted Star Trek to feel like.
Yeah.
And it does, fill me with hope. And, I was reading an article about, even saying this phrase, but like the problem of masculinity in the modern world.
Okay.
And obviously, we do have problems with masculinity and finding new models of masculinity. But one of the ones that this article brought up, and I genuinely believe is true, is that perhaps Picard is a great goal for a masculine role model in the modern world. He is calm, he is easygoing, he is progressive, he is strong, he is empathetic, he shows emotion, he represses emotion, he does it all. And he does it without alienating the people around him or making them feel bad about themselves or having to bang everything in the universe. And I adore Picard, and I think he's just amazing as a captain. And I can't even imagine how weird that must have seemed to fans at the time, how different he is than Kirk. And of course, Riker is the Kirk stand-in, and Riker's an HR nightmare walking through the ship.
Yeah.
But I think that there's so much on Next Gen that actually does hold up really well. There's some things that don't, but for modern viewers, and I think that with streaming and everything, there are a lot of people who are still discovering it for the first time.
Somebody must, I'm sure if you go back and through a microfiche of old newspapers or something, somebody must have hated Picard or thought that he was inferior, but...
Kirk versus Picard was like the original Usenet argument.
Yeah, but you can't, with fans of a certain age, there is no argument over that question, it's
none.
just Picard.
Like, absolutely none.
Yeah.
But at the time, I do remember in the, a little bit at the time, people, there was no question then that Kirk was the superior captain and always would be. And I think that Patrick Stewart, being who he is and having stayed in the public eye but in a different way than Shatner has, and having a very successful career in other science fiction, but remaining this very jocular, kind-hearted public figure, has had a lot to do with people remembering Picard very fondly. That said, Picard is kind of a jerk in the first season.
Well, yeah.
Like he is not fully himself yet, and it's definitely the season where he tells Wesley to shut up and does other things that are not great models of masculinity. But I think that Picard and Dale Cooper, to name check Twin Peaks again, are two real models of masculine protagonists that I would love to see more men like that in media.
Yeah, Dale Cooper especially.
Yeah.
Not the new Dale Cooper, Evil Dale.
No, not
bad news.
Dale.
I was just thinking that like psychic powers are something that are a big part of like mid 20th century sci-fi and space opera, and they appear, they don't appear in Trek after they're in the second pilot where no man has gone before, because Gary Mitchell is, Esper has an Esper rating, but that gets relegated to other races like Vulcans and Beta Zeds. Why do you think that they steered Trek away from like psychicness?
Well, I think it's OP, basically.
Oh, okay. All right.
like it has to be nerfed. Like Troy has to be nerfed. She's mostly useless, except in a couple episodes where they let her be at least somewhat useful to the plot. But like they couldn't have just a psychic on the Enterprise, because it's like having a cell phone in a horror movie. It makes plot harder. If you've got like just a great psychic on deck, It just makes it more difficult to have deceptive plot lines.
Yeah.
And if you look at something like Babylon 5, they've got psychics floating all around, psionics and everything, but they have different levels, and I think it's very deliberate that the one that's super powerful gets canned in the first season, and you end up with somebody who's like a level 2. Like half beta Z, so that we can actually have plots where people hide their intentions. Without it breaking the rules that were set up.
That Ferengi seems untrustworthy. Okay, all right.
Oh, you think maybe? Oh, thanks, Troy. Really helped. Yeah. I'm glad you're here.
I think it's fascinating that we see Picard's mother in this episode. It's clearly affecting for him, and despite the clunky dialogue that Stewart gets in the first season, it's great work here by Stewart. You see like 10 emotions pass over his face. There's
no dialogue that he can't make gold out of.
Oh, yeah. And then we don't talk about her ever again. I don't think she's even mentioned.
Mom just poured some tea and peaced out.
Yeah, it's so strange in that way. All of our characters handle their the Solaris situation that they're in here pretty well. And they're kind of freaked out. But something else that I love about the heroic quality of these characters is when they're having their little confab on the bridge, Data's like, he's not going to see anybody, but he's like, we could stick around and like explore. And everybody's like, we could do that, but we should probably get back home. Even in the face of this existential terror, they're like, let's check it out. Let's fire some probes.
Yeah, no, and I think that I again, if you were shooting this now, you'd probably have a 3-episode arc, right?
Yeah.
You'd probably do something with this, and you'd use it to explore some of the crew and where they're coming from and what their little past traumas are and everything. There's a little bit of that with the Targ, and you see a little bit of who Worf must be and a little bit of who Picard must be. Yeah. I think it's interesting in that scene, rewatching it in preparation for this podcast. I was like, so it's because of what Yvette says that Picard's actually talking to her as though she might be an alien intelligence rather than just a hallucination.
Yes.
And she answers back as though she is as well. So I think that even him thinking that that's who she is informs what she says back.
Makes her that, yeah.
It's actually a very interesting little scene. I think purely down to the acting in that scene. And so you kind of see this give and take between them. And there's like the fire hallucination and everything. Yeah. I think that the only real disappointment to the episode for me is that we don't spend more time in that.
Yeah.
And of course it is a situation that can rapidly get out of control. But I kind of like to see the out of control. But I understand that in episode 5 you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
Not in an era where there's 28 episodes in a season.
Yeah,
now, sure.
Yeah, there's a suggestion that it could be dangerous, that they could, lose themselves and they wouldn't distinguish between reality and fantasy anymore. But I don't think there's any real danger that's sold to us. This is running theme in Trek, especially with a character like Q or the Traveler, where a godlike alien comes in and tells us, you think you're so curious, but curiosity's dangerous. Be careful. Learning too much can destroy you, too much knowledge. Yeah. But in this case, the Traveler is like the opposite. He literally says that they've been around for all of humanity's existence, and we're literally now only interesting because we're throwing ourselves into the void looking for stuff. And like the Traveler's like, well, we dig that.
Absolutely. And it's definitely a softer, gentler kind of final frontier there, and but of course Q takes them directly somewhere dangerous in order to hurt
immediately
them. He does it on purpose, and he does it.
Cyborg zombies. What do you guys think?
I think just to see what they'll do. Whereas the Traveler is not actively trying to harm humans as a species and doesn't have any animosity towards them. And he in fact says that up until recently humans were uninteresting, which of course for a human being is actually the worst insult. Right. We wouldn't mind being called monsters. Just don't want to be called late for dinner. To call it interesting.
This is the Mean Joe Green giving the kid the sunglasses. It's like, oh, thanks, we're interesting.
Yeah. So, I think the Traveler is a very different sense of that. And I think the episode's very much meant to invoke that sense of wonder that classic science fiction does. I think that's kind of the whole purpose of that episode, to sort of make Next Gen seem like, oh, we're going to go further than the original series did. We're going to like really explore the edges of things. And even that whole the relationship between thought and reality and all that kind of harkens back to like the explosion of the psychological sciences and psychiatry in the 70s and the 60s, which really made their way into science fiction in a big way.
Yeah. The Traveler is Timothy Leary. We got it.
Yeah, exactly. No, like open your consciousness, tune in, drop out.
I think the writers showed amazing restraint in giving us the cat for Tasha Yar instead of what she could be imagining. Because
Tasha can't stop saying the phrase rape gang.
Once again, they got to drop in rape gangs. Yeah.
It's so awkward. Oh, man, when she's trying to seduce Data and she brings it up, I'm like, girl, what are you doing? You have no game at all.
That's not game.
Come on. No.
There's...
and she brings it, I don't know, the actress, I love Denise Crosby, I really do. But, oh my God, like she just seems to have no idea how to deliver that in a way that is just not dropping flaming sack of poo at a dinner party. Like it's just so inappropriate the time she brings it up. I feel bad for her trauma and everything, but like she brings it up a lot.
I think there's
I got a kitty cat, and that kitty cat was nicely groomed.
Oh yeah, it was not all straggly
at all.
I think there's a fascinating idea there. The idea of what happens to one of these colonies in this amazing utopia that isn't getting what it needs, and it sort of breaks off from the utopia. What happens? But again, that's not something I think that Trek is looking to explore. If you've got a show like Trek that's set in this utopia where the establishment itself is benevolent, can Trek even get in on this punk business? Is there such a thing as Trek punk?
Well, I mean, the thing is that Star Trek has given up on that utopia thing a long time ago. Roddenberry's gone, and I think that the subsequent writers very quickly decided that they weren't really into humans being fully evolved yet the way he was. And so you see that with DS9, with the amazing episode in the Pale Moonlight. You see with the whole Dominion War and all of the moral complications of that.
Right.
And I think that DS9, DS9 is kind of a reaction to Trek, even though it aired during possibly the most Trek saturated time till what's going to happen with CBS just dumping a million Star Treks on us. But I think that we're going to see it. We're about to see it with all of these new CBS shows and Paramount shows. We're going to see it with Picard, I think, with Star Trek Picard. I think we're going to see a really different kind of show. I mean, the fact that the protagonists are 7 of 9 in Picard, like, we're already mashing things up. And I don't think Patrick Stewart would come back for anything less than something really amazing. And of course, if you think about the last X-Men he did, Logan, I think Logan's probably a real preview into what we're going to see with Picard. And I think that Logan is kind of a punk against the previous X-Men movies. So I think absolutely, if you let go of the idea that Starfleet is fully benevolent and humans are awesome, which even Next Gen does, Starfleet is infiltrated by those weird scanners aliens at one point. They're not scanners aliens, they just make the head explode like in scanners.
Right.
Little, wormy aliens, which we also get resolved in one episode. Thank you, early 90s television. We get into Starfleet being fallible, even in Next Gen, and definitely by the time DS9, Voyager, Enterprise. But of course, Discovery is a prequel, so Starfleet can be a little rougher around the edges. It can be a little less perfect, even though it's supposed to be only 10 years before.
Well, yeah.
Whatever. But I think that with all of these different takes on Star Trek that they're going to start putting out in order to franchise the thing to death again, we're gonna see some punk out there. We're gonna see some reactions, because that's what people like to do nowadays. Yeah. I get it with like both the tie-ins that I've done. I went into something that I loved and saw what I could do to upend the assumptions of it. Yeah. And I think that's one of the first things you kind of want to upend, because if you look at Starfleet, it's a colonialist organization. It is. Look, I'm as big a Trekkie as anybody. I think you can tell that by this point in the podcast. And I love Starfleet and I love all of the people in it. But you can't ignore that Q is sometimes right when he talks about, and so is Quark. when they talk about human beings and going out into the galaxy and what they do and how they assimilate.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of why the Borg have been such a powerful metaphor, because there is a sense in which that Starfleet assimilates as well.
Yeah.
And you're looking at something that is very much sort of part Dutch East India Company and part Amazon or Microsoft, when you look at Starfleet. And they are benevolent, but it is still made up of flawed people, and you see it in many different episodes. And I think you can keep a utopia and still have realistic human characters.
I hope so. Yeah.
So I think that's going to probably be a tension in the future Star Trek series.
I both want it and I don't, because I agree that, like, I think we've taken it as far as we can, this sort of setting our stories in this utopian society and then looking at other people, aliens, and saying, oh boy, they got problems. And I've maintained for a long time that I think the most fictional element of Trek is the idea that we get all of our collective shit together and we are a utopia. But at the same time, something about it being like that metaphorical city on the hill is reassuring to me. I'm a big fan of the culture novels of Ian M. Banks.
Yeah.
And he would, he spun out so many of them. And every time he'd do another one, the fans are like, oh, when's he going to write one about the fall of the culture, which in his books is this very federation, socio-anarchic society. Yeah. And I think his thing was like, why would it fall? Like, what if this is where the books are set? Like, don't you want this? This is like the perfect society. Like, my supposition in this fictional world is, if you solve the problem, maybe it stays solved. And so I hate to see Picard or another series set 50 or 100 years in the future that the Federation has fallen into ruins, but, it's a story. Maybe we got to go where the story is.
Well, I mean, that's clearly part of where Discovery is going with the Vidraish thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's, millennia in the future. I don't know. I don't know that I can be mad about that, but maybe because I keep coming back to the Picard series. It is Star Trek Picard, so obviously it's going. I just made a grand gesture with my hand. Star Trek Picard! Exclamation point! And maybe the utopia does not reach to the human soul, and so everybody, there is no human evolution that would have you go through as much as Picard has gone through without emotional damage. And that's what the episode family is about, and I assume that's part of what Picard the series is going to be about. And I think that with Section 31 and all, they want to bring all this dark cloak and dagger stuff into it, and that's all well and good if it is toward that Federation and Starfleet that we know and love. But I don't, much like we were talking, to bring it back around to what we were talking about with Wesley and Mary Sue, I mean, Starfleet is an organizational Mary Sue, essentially.
Well, yeah.
And none of us are particularly mad about it. But, maybe it's a little more hard won if we see them fail sometimes.
Oh, for sure.
And the Starfleet still does have elected officials. We've seen them before. They still have ranks. They still have people that vie for promotions and get them or don't get them. Not everyone is going to succeed at the ideals. And maybe if we see people fail and pick themselves up and fix it, that will feel more real to us.
I think Gene was right in a way that maybe the goal is to have no human conflict, but of course, from a fictional perspective, that's worthless. So we have to have conflict. So utopia in real life, break it all apart in the fiction. That's what I say.
Yeah.
Well, as we get to the end of the show here, is there anything left unsaid that you wanted to still say about Where No One Has Gone Before?
Troi has huge eyes, and it's one of her weird hairdos before they sort of settle on the sort of three of them.
Yeah.
It's also, she got the tight cat suit going on. I think that Troi is kind of one of the most tragic characters of Trek. She had very little to do with this episode, but every time I see her in the early seasons, I'm like, if they had just put her in a uniform, a regular uniform, like everyone else, she would have been taken very differently as a character by everyone in fandom and otherwise. If she had there is no reason to not have a ship's counselor. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
Like, organizationally, you need one. These people are literally going where no one has gone before. They are going to suffer all the psychological issues we were just talking about. You should have a shrink on the ship. Absolutely. It's unfortunate that she was treated like a sex kitten for so long. But much later on when she goes in for her command qualification and you see her in just a regular uniform, you can see what that character might have been. And so every time I see her in these early episodes where it's the worst she ever gets treated, just is such an object and so the subject of everyone's gaze and is not given hardly anything to do except sit there and look pretty next to Picard on the bridge. I feel so bad for Marina Sirtis, and I feel the tragedy of a character that could have been a lot better than she was.
Yeah, a character, and you see when she's in uniform, you understand how successful and professional she is. Mm-hmm. You know, she's a lieutenant commander, just like anybody else here. And just because she's not juggling isolinear chips, or flying the ship or something like that, we don't see that. We're getting that now with current series. Like a lot of people are big fans of Jane Brooke as Admiral Cornwell, myself included. Although they give her a real dumb death. But spoilers for season 2. But getting that same feeling that we could have got for Troy for characters that we have now.
Yeah, and you can see it with Battlestar Galactica and sort of, the characters that serve that role of sort of nurturing and counseling people who are have a collective trauma. Not everything is better by a long shot in current television, but I don't think that they would make Troy the same now. They definitely have tried to rehabilitate that aspect of her in the movies and things like that, but there's only so far you can go with such an established character. But I do feel like they could have. I mean, everyone's thoughts become reality. What's going on with Troy? Like that should have been half the episode, really, right. Because she, what in the world effect does this have on her, and all of that. And of course, she has the same kind of backstory that Worf does, but Worf's is treated much more seriously, where she's caught between two worlds and doesn't identify fully with either of them. But it's all kind of brought in with Loxana and treated as a joke rather than. Except that one episode where Loxana does the holodeck thing with Alexander, which is a episode that few people talk about, and it's actually a really good episode.
Really?
I think it's goofy. It's super goofy. Yeah. Like if you just an episode in GIFs, it's ridiculous. Yeah, right. The dancing clown and everything. Yeah. But what Loxana says to Alexander and what she does throughout the whole episode, she is giving this little boy therapy. Yeah. She is treating a little boy that nobody is taking care of and who has an incredible trauma from his mother dying. And I think that what she says to him in their little hot tub mud puddle is really genuinely well written and touching. And it's one of the few times that Loxana just behaves as a normal person who is not, who cares about other people and is not a walking joke. I look at Troy and I just am like, I wish you just could have been a regular crew member, like all the other crew members, because it would have made for a better story. So that's the only other thing I think I have to say about the episode.
Maybe we'll get something good along those lines when she appears in Picard.
Yeah, maybe.
Let's talk My Space Dad Can Beat Up Your Space Dad. Who's your favorite captain and why?
Oh, I mean, it has to be Picard. Maybe a little bit. I really do enjoy Sisko, and I enjoy Avery Brooks a lot. I think he deserves so much respect for taking some really left turn acting choices with something that could have been very locked down and straightforward. And his voice is just up and all over the place, and he is a great father. But I gotta say that Picard's my man. Like he's an archaeology dork. I majored in classics. He's not as old as you think. He's only in his mid-40s. It's just that he's never had hair.
Right.
He's kind to most people. He feels things very deeply, but he can control his emotions. He doesn't have to punch or bang everything. I love Picard, and he is a great strategic mind. And very, very rarely blows up his own ship. Only occasionally does he really make the wrong choice. And I think that if you're looking for a captain that fully embodies the ideals of Starfleet, like the best Starfleet can be, you gotta say it's Picard.
I have to agree with that. I like the fact that he lost the Stargazer, and then when the Enterprise D goes down, he's like, "That wasn't me. That wasn't on." on the planet. Now that we've reached the end of the show, you'll receive a commission and the rank of ensign. What department on the ship do you work in?
Command. I gotta be in charge.
Interesting. So you're going to be a red shirt then. Now, many command people start off as, attachés or in some aspect of command or negotiation that then blossoms into, actually being in charge of people. So is there some subset there that you'd be involved in?
Yeah, I think I'd be a good negotiator.
Okay.
Yeah. Not as good as Deanna, obviously.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I think that, as a writer, one of the things that I can do very well is to empathize with people's positions that I don't personally take, and work out realistic ways for those positions to be satisfied.
Yeah.
So I think I would be a good negotiator.
I suppose you'd have to. There's got to be speechwriters in the 24th century still.
Sure. I would imagine.
Or maybe there's an AI, like an app or something like that you can give me a speech for this.
Maybe I'd just be Jake writing my articles.
The internet's down. I can't get this out.
Post them to Spacebook.
Spacebook. There you go. MySpace. Already been done. Ensign Valente, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can at EISTpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
I am Cat Valente on Twitter, Cat Valente on Patreon, and CM Valente on Facebook.
And do you have any work coming up that we should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so my Minecraft tie-in book, which is called The End, is coming out November 5th. Mm-hmm. And I had a child recently, so there'll be a little bit of a gap in 2020. I think I've got a couple novellas coming out, and then, oh my God, so much will be coming out in 2021.
Okay. All right. Well, listeners should keep an eye out for that. And thanks again for joining me.
All right. Thank you.
We are signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.